All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to see this big crowd. This is a biological sciences department seminar. Our speaker today is John Marlin, and I actually met John about 10 years ago. We don't remember exactly when. He gave a seminar here. He's going to be talking about native plants, and I had just bought a house and was interested in that. So through the years, John has actually been a real encouragement and actually a supporter of my habit. So I think he might be winding down now, but he's been really supportive to me in gardening. So Dr. Marlin is a lifelong Illinois resident. He received degrees from the University of Illinois, including a PhD in entomology of insects. While a student, he worked on Hymenoptera, so wasps, I think.
He's answerable.
Okay. So he was then executive director of the Coalition on American Rivers between 1972 and 83. And in that, he worked on a multi-state effort to protect the upper Mississippi watershed from dams. Then he was appointed to the Illinois Pollution Control Board, where he served until 93. He was a chairman for 5 years, and some of the things he did there were to initiate regulations and laws about scrap tires to control mosquito populations. Dr. Marlin then joined the Illinois Sustainability Technology Center, where he was for quite a while. While there, he coordinated the Illinois DNR, or Department of Natural Resources, efforts on livestock waste management and reusing sediment. And he has interesting stories about that, right? So I have to keep cutting this down and cutting this down. There's been a lot of stuff I've been hearing about for a couple of days. You can ask him more later. So, but I will say, he retired in 2010, and he continues efforts to encourage the understanding of native pollinators and plants. He is currently the president of the Land Conservation Foundation and Illinois Land Trust, which some of you are familiar with that kind of thing. I forgot the title. Oh, the title is here. So Dr. Marlin will be talking about growing native plants for landscapes and pollinators. John.
Hello, I guess it's afternoon, so good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, that's a good idea. I'm going to cover a lot of material. Some of the slides I have are pulled, these slides are pulled from about 10 different presentations I give on different topics. So I'm not going to read everything on the slides. I'll just get the stuff that's relevant for today. If I can make this work.
A little arrow, just
Yeah.
left and right.
Left arrow, right arrow.
I got this to work before. So, no. Oh, so maybe we have to do this. Okay, you ready? So I'll try it now.
No, we'll try it. Okay, roughly 40 years ago, maybe 30 actually, I bought a house with a lot of wildflowers, and after a couple of years, my kids got to be 6 and 8, and they wanted to sell ice cream or something on the street to make money, and I said, no, everybody does that. Why don't we weed my garden and see if anybody will buy native plants? So we've made about 100 pots of plants and had a sale make $400 in a couple hours. So the kids kept doing it for years. They would hire their friends to help. And lots of kids learned about plants in my yard and made some money while they were doing it. If you've got your own kids and want to think about this, in two 4-hour sales in my driveway one year, my kids grossed $5,000 when they were in high school.
How do I see what had been
That's
on
1,000 pots at $5 a pot. These are my grandkids and a friend.
Well, he's the guy that's
We're gonna
doing the
talk about
talk is
pollinators and some
Yeah.
studies that I was involved with. When you want to benefit pollinators, it's important to have a variety of species with different flower types. They don't all have to be in your yard. Your neighbors can have some and you can have another. You need different blooming times over the season. You don't just plant butterfly, the orange butterfly weed, because that only blooms a short time. The adults need pollen or nectar when they get here. They need pollen and nectar later, and then they need to eat when they're getting ready to migrate home. It's good to provide a little water so they can get a drink and maintain suitable nesting sites by not having every square foot of your ground covered with dense grass or concrete. There are about 4,000 species of bees in the United States. 70% nest in soil. The other 30% nest in wood or stems, or in the wood or stems. And then there's 47 species that are social, like bumblebees and honeybees. Most bee species are solitary, and this is important. They are single females. After they mate, the males die. The female is on her own to dig her nest, gather pollen, nectar, lay the eggs, and do whatever maintenance the nest needs. And then she dies after about a month. So these bees need a little bit of help. And pollen and nectar is the help they need the most. A lot of these bees are active only a few weeks in the spring or fall, some for a couple months. So if you're trying to collect them or something, they're hard to find if you're not there when the bees are out. It's also a reason you want to have plants that last into the fall and early in the spring. Something to think about. In North America, there's one honeybee species and roughly 50 bumblebees. I say roughly because they're always changing what they call the different names. One honeybee colony can use all of the pollen and nectar resources that 100,000 native bees could use on their own. These single females are being competed with by a honeybee hive of 50,000 workers. That's not good if you're a solitary bee. So it's a good idea not to have honeybee hives in great quantity. Especially don't be putting it in natural areas where you're trying to encourage native plants and native bees. As rural habitat disappears, and by that I mean the roadsides are now mostly mowed. There's very little land that are still in hedgerows and things. There's almost no habitat. I drove in on Route 136 from Urbana. There's almost nowhere where the roadside isn't concrete, grass, corn, or beans. Nothing for the critters. So urban centers are becoming sort of a refuge for bees. This is a shot of a rural area. You can see that the land is in big chunks. In some areas further away from the river, there's one farm can be 3,000 to 5,000 acres, managed the same way or managed by a bank. So there's not much interest in native habitat. And there's very few owners. In town, on the other hand, you have hundreds and hundreds of individual owners with a piece of property that they control. So if there are any leftover refuge species of bees, butterflies, and some other things around your town or in little enclaves in small neighborhood areas, and you start getting native plants scattered around town, these bees can expand a bit and hopefully recolonize much of the state later on. You can put things like, here's honeysuckle. How many removed honeysuckle? Lots of people, okay. Honeysuckle is frequently hollow. You can tie the honeysuckle in bundles and put it horizontally on your property, and the bees that nest in stems will put their nests in the holes. Do not get these big commercial bee houses because that puts a big collection of bees in a small space. The parasites find it and do great damage to the bees. Bees also need water. Carlinville, Illinois is, I call it the bee capital of the world. It's just south of Springfield. There have been bee studies there for more than 100 years. Charles Robertson collected bees within 10 miles of Carlinville between 1884 and 1916. The Natural History Survey has his collection, and I have gone through the whole thing. He recorded 15,000 insect visitors on 441 plants, mostly natives. It's one of the biggest databases in the world that's old, that has the insect name, the plant it was collected on, and other information, which is something that was not done prior to the late 1800s. He got 297 bees, 367 other Hymenoptera, 446 flies, 99 butterflies and moths, 153 beetles, etc. This is his spreadsheet. When I was doing my study, I knew he could not have written his book unless he had a spreadsheet, but he didn't have a computer. What the poor guy did was took a book this big and has 8 sections in it. There are, notice the pages. Each of those pages, when opened out, looks like this. There are 230 or 290 some bee names down this side going across that book. There are 442 plants listed, and they are all hand coordinated. Imagine the amount of work that took without a computer. I did work there in 1970 and 72. For those of you at the INHS, I was an undergrad student there actually they brought me in from somewhere else. I didn't go to U of I at the time, but they brought me in to work on bees and ants in 1968, full-time in the summer, because they could not find a graduate student or anybody who was willing to study bees by doing field work and taxonomy. Everybody was into gel electrophoresis, and taxonomy was dead and they didn't want to collect. So they reached down. They actually tried to get me out of high school, but I'd already signed a contract with the Boy Scouts. So anyway, between 1970 and 72, and I was just finished my junior year in 1970. So while I was a senior in college, I was traveling to Carlinville just about every week on the weekend, but I collected mostly on weekends and during the summer a lot more. I collected all the bees I could find except apis, bumblebees, and parasitic bees. There's reasons for that. The big one on bumblebees, if you've ever collected them, they regurgitate right away and smear all the other specimens in your collecting tube. I used a sweep net, which is pretty much what Robertson did, although he did a lot of just observation once he knew the species by sight. I spent 163 person hours collecting, and I concentrated on 24 plants, which I selected because Robertson had caught the most bees on those plants, and collectively they spanned the growing season. And all of my specimens are retained. There's over 10,000 of them in the Natural History Survey. To give you an idea of getting into the bees and plant part, different plants have different amounts of attractiveness to bees. Lactuga canadensis, Robertson only found 1 bee species on in almost 30 years of observation. Astropelosis, on the other hand, had 90 bees, and Claytonia virginica had 58. This is the queen of spring woodland wildflowers, or 58 species of bees on it. Astropelosis, 90 in the fall. That is a plant or something similar you want in the fall. These are plants I collected on, just become aware that there was 24 of them. Level of effort on the species Claytonia virginica, the best species in the spring to grow. In the 1880s, Robertson spent 10 years, he recorded 10 years where he looked at that plant and 31 days during those 10 years. I spent 14 hours and 45 minutes collecting on that plant on 2 years, and I had 12 sites where I collected. I kept a little more data than he did. He just said, on this plant, the bee is absent, present, frequent, or abundant. And he never explained whether frequent or abundant had more bees. Based on his data sets, I assumed it was abundant. In the 2000, a group from Wash University in St. Louis contacted me. I gave them all my location data, et cetera, so they could go to Carlinville and duplicate my collecting. They were only able to do spring plants. They spent 106 hours and 26 minutes collecting at 14 sites. So they did a lot of the stuff I did. Without boring you with details, the results of those studies were, I'm the red line, Robertson's the black line. This is true across all the genera. I found almost no difference in the species that were present. That doesn't mean there's difference in abundance, but the species present, we were virtually identical. A few 70 some years later, in 2009 and 10, They only found half the bees on Claytonia and the other species, other plants they looked at. Half the bees that Robertson and I found. I collected 0.59 bees per minute on Claytonia virginica. They collected 0.14. That is a big drop in the amount of effort it took to collect any old bee on that plant. An interesting sideline. I did not concentrate on the bumblebees. Here's a list of the bumblebees that Robertson found. The number of bees I found with almost no effort, all but one of the bees he collected, and one of our natural history survey people, Grixty, caught one a few years later. So all of the bumblebees that were present in Robertson's day were present in between 1970 and 1990. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but if you've done anything with botany or entomology, you know that the scientific names of insects and plants are changing dramatically because the geneticists think they know a lot about species. But my advisor back in the old days said, remember, a genetic marker is just one more character on your critter. Okay, so if you look at these, the Ys in this column, and this is the genus Megachile. The Ys are species that Robertson collected. The one he did not collect that I did came into the country after Robertson did his work. There's plants or species that I did not collect, even though I collected on 24 plants. The reason I likely did not collect them was that they were not expected. They were not present on the 24 plants that I collected on, that Robertson did collect on, I didn't. So it's logical that I wouldn't have them. I developed a simple mathematical formula taking into account what Robertson said the abundance of each bee was and how many hours I spent on individual plants for all the plants, did it by hand. And I came up with an index of expectation. Anything above 134 is in the upper quartile. The zeros were obviously the lower quartile. So if you look at these numbers, almost every bee that I collected had a pretty good expectation, except Megachile taxana, which we can't figure out why I didn't get it, and the other people didn't get it, but that's an aberration. Don't worry about the words here. Look at the green. This upper group is largely bumblebees, honeybees, etc. And the 24 plants across there, where it's marked in green, Robertson collected the plant, or collected that bee on a plant. Notice all of these cover the entire growing season. Those are generalists like honeybees and bumblebees that are active all year. This blank area is spring growing plants, spring blooming. These bees are found in the fall. Notice here in the fall, those bees are found on the fall plants. This is about the easiest way I can show this. Down here, you have a list of spring bees, and notice that they almost all are found in the spring. But very few of them get over into early summer. This slide is confusing, but the bottom line is Robertson caught 297 kinds of bees on his plants. What people need to understand if they're trying to get into this is that many bees only go to one or two plants. There are some that only go to one plant. They are dependent on that plant. So if you look across the bottom, this is the number of plants of the 24, not necessarily the same plant. And you'll notice that on all 24 plants, only 70 bee species were found on only one of the 24 plants. 83 were found on none of the plants. So if you add up all these numbers and subtract, or you add all of these numbers to 83, you get the 297. So the bottom line is various plants have various attractiveness. Only one bee species was found on almost all of those 24 plants. It was found on 23. One one species of bee was found on the groups of 18, 19, and 20 plants. That might be confusing, but the bottom line is bees don't all go to the plants. So you need a variety of plants to do any good. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about the plants and the bees. I always use this slide because everybody who sees it will never, ever forget it. Ice cream cone is like a plant that grew and evolved to handle short-tongued bees. Any bee, with very few exceptions, can come here and get nectar or pollen. And there's a whole group of bees called short-tongued bees that go to plants like that. On the other hand, if you've got a deep sundae type dish and the ice cream's in the bottom and you don't have a spoon or you can't manipulate a spoon, you're not going to get any ice cream. Same thing's true of plants and bees and butterflies. Plants with a long corolla have basically evolved with long-tongued bees. And that includes bumblebees. Some bees actually have a tongue longer than their body so they can reach in to some of those tropical plants that you see. I'm going to go fast through some of these things, but give you an idea again. This is Claytonia virginica, the most important plant in the spring. Find a way to get them in your yard. It had 21 long and 37 short-tongued bees and almost nothing else on them. Ipomea pandurata is a plant with a very long corolla. It's a viney thing. 14 long-tongued bees, no short-tongued bees. The short-tongued bees can't get at the nectar. And some of the bees on this plant are only found on this plant. Aster pilosus, this is the best one in the fall, and all the asters are good, but an aster like this one that blooms late into the season is very good because it's the last source of nectar for many bees, butterflies, etc. Notice there's 90 species of bees, 54 other Hymenoptera, 119 Diptera, 30 butterflies and moths, and a few other things that go to that plant in the fall because it's available. Other tree plants like this one, the Trillium, no bees, no butterflies. A problem we have is that people, park districts, the National Park Service, all these entities like to have pretty plants out front, most of which are not native. They don't support native butterflies because they can't eat the leaves, but they're pretty. Some of them support bees, many of them don't. So I'm trying to convince park districts to put at least a few native plants in these plantings, especially the ones where they'll put in one group of plants in the spring, then they'll dig them all out and have their staff put another one in the summer and then another one later in the summer, wasting a huge amounts of money and time. They could at least integrate a few natives in with that. Here's a University of Illinois planting of Echinacea and some short grasses. People loved this until the flowers were done and they got a little bit ragtag. I always compare this to your grandmother. When grandma was in her 20s and 30s, she was beautiful. When she got into her 60s and 70s, she started to look a little bit not so nice, right? If you're a 20-year-old guy, she doesn't look that good. Well, people had the same reaction. And I always tell people, well, you don't shoot grandma, do you? But so you'll remember that. But what the university did, they got complaints. Even after they mowed the stuff early in the fall, people didn't like this either. So they went and replaced it with non-native other stuff. People do that all the time. Now, America is supposedly a diverse thing where you can talk to your neighbors about anything. This is a good example of freedom in America. These people are on the Old English system, grass and manicured bushes. These people, next door neighbor, the yard is a bit excessive even by my standards. There's even corn in there. They got all kinds of plants, but it's an idea of what you can do. Other people are more modest. Here's a patriotic American with a variety of native plants and non-native plants. There's nothing wrong with mixing the two. The important thing is to get a bunch of natives in there. Here's a sidewalk in Urbana that the city has not, for some reason, forced them to mow along. Those are all natives. With your native plants, especially if you're talking to the city, tell them to put the really tall things like big sunflowers behind the fire station or somewhere. Don't put them right out in front of City Hall where they're gonna fall on the sidewalk and somebody's gonna trip and sue the city. But you can find places in your yard to put them, or you can get short ones like Little Dorit, which is a cultivar which only grows about that tall. This is my yard, the side yard. They'll give you an idea of something I'm trying to do is show people, and I've had lots of tours of this area, how they can have native plants that are socially acceptable. The idea is don't go to Walmart and buy a packet of wildflower seeds. There's seeds in there that are good for Texas and Maine and everything in between. A lot of them are not native or they are not supposed to grow here and they become invasive. So what I have started doing is taking this little area, and these are about 4 foot by 5 foot areas back here. This is a big circle. There are 5 species of short plants there that bloom at different times of the year. Behind, that's my wife's rhubarb. I couldn't, you know. Those of you who are married know how that works, but over here, we had prairie coreopsis, short echinacea, there's Rudbeckia in there and a variety of other plants. Back here, there are 3 tall species, rattlesnake master, blue sage, Solidago rigida, things like that, that cluster well. The beauty of something like this is you can put these plants in your front yard or in front of the city building. Nobody's going to be upset. They're blooming all year. Some of these other things you don't want to be upfront, but you also don't want to mix them. If you put Rudbeckia hirta in your wildflower garden in the middle of it, or you put Zizia aurea in most cases, now the different areas have different results, but a lot of plants are very aggressive and they will take over your whole wildflower garden. I put plants like that off in a little patch by themselves, or if they're adjacent to one of my others, I can take a shovel any time of the year and cut them off. That's the other thing about growing wildflowers. Don't be afraid to kill some. Think of yourself as a doctor back in the Middle Ages. You dig up bodies so you can study them. If you want your garden to work, you've got to be willing to weed out pretty wildflowers that are taking over. Here's that little area with the 5 species in the spring. That is Penstemon pallidus and a variety of other things coming up. Here it is a little later with butterfly milkweed, vervain, let's see, what is it? Verbena hosta. There's some liatris in there and some other things. But the bottom line is, these are blooming all through the season. Bees can get them any old time. Behind them is a variety of other things. And here's those sunflowers I mentioned. This is Little Dorit. There's another one that only grows 18 inches high. You can use them to accent things without messing up the whole yard. In my backyard, I've got the same system going on, but with different groups of taller prairie plants. There's bee balm, Culver's root. I can't remember what's in the middle there. Over here, there's shadier, so there's some Penstemon digitalis and etc. Give you an idea of how bad things can go quickly. This area was planted in 2011, I think, by the university. There was a decent wildflower mix put in. And you can see that a couple of years later, there's good diversity and everything's pretty. And now,
Yes.
Solidago altissima and New England aster have taken over. The other plants are still there, but in very reduced numbers. And I don't have a good way to get rid of those things. They've also let Tree of Heaven and a few other things come in. This is an example. I think this is Solidago altissima. It shows you the long underground stems that allow it to start growing here and then pop up over there. They're very tall, they're dense, and you can see the root system and how big they are, and they make thousands and thousands of seeds. Other things to know: May apples, beautiful plant, worthless for bees and butterflies, but it's a nice plant. But like many woodland wildflowers, if you go out in the woods, you'll see trillium in a little patch. You'll see mayaples in a big patch. You'll see wild ginger in a big patch. These plants, if they find a favorable habitat, they grow like wild. And they try very hard to, they try it. Yeah, plants don't try it, but some people think otherwise. But anyway, look how dense that is. This is underneath. This is like the Amazon rainforest. Hardly anything can grow at ground level because the sunlight doesn't get through. Zizia aurea, wonderful bee plant, pretty when it's in bloom, good for several butterflies. But my gosh, after 2 or 3 years, it makes billions of seeds and it takes over the whole patch. So what I do is every fall I get my clippers, and after they're done blooming, I cut off all the seed heads. I do that for a lot of the plants that you don't want to take over your whole garden. Who cares if you kill 1 billion seeds? There's 1 billion more next door. So anyway, that kind of thing happens. Here's trillium, another plant that does nothing for bees, but it does things for several other critters. But again, notice how the leaves overlap and they make these patches. I think that's how they maintain themselves. If you've got a situation and you've got growing plants, these started out as just little 2-inch pots. What I did for this lady who was a friend of mine who wanted to fill in her front area, I got her about 8 species, but the ginger, geranium, celandine poppy, several other tall or plants that are kind of aggressive. If you put them all in at the same time, they compete, I'll use the term fairly. And years later, that area, this isn't that area, but years later, those plants are all doing well because when they butt up against somebody of equal size and they aren't growing underground, they will stay in place. This is, it's probably my front yard, a woodland area. And you can see the geraniums can get pretty aggressive. I hate hostas. I call them hostels because they grow so big and they smother everything. I tell people who like hostas and want to have a wildflower garden, put your wildflower garden up close to the house, maybe 10 feet out, then go 3 more feet and put in hostas. When the woodland wildflowers go dormant, the hostas will be big and they'll be blooming and everybody's happy. But if you put the hostas in with the natives are going to die. Here's bluebells. Why is this? This is somebody's backyard in Urbana. For the last 20 years, I've taken pictures here. This is solid bluebells, right? Until the middle of May. Then the bluebells go dormant and I call it patchy grass. This is a heavily wooded backyard. In the patchy grass, you can grow bluebells, spring beauty, dentaria, anything that's ephemeral. It'll come up and make your yard, if it's shady enough, beautiful in the spring. They go dormant, grass comes up and you mow from June till October. You can take many of the natives, here's a bluebell. Many natives you can put in a bed of English ivy. How many of your neighbors have English ivy who might really like having some bluebells and bellflower and things like that come up and then go away? When these plants go dormant, they suck all the juices into the ground to make their rhizome bigger. So we're just about done here. And if you need plants, Google native plant nurseries. You'll get a bunch of them. This is from Missouri Wildflowers. They all give you huge amounts of information on the plants, when they grow, what color they are, whether butterflies like them, whether hummingbirds like them, and whether or not they're socially acceptable. May apples look like this if you dig them up in the fall. In the spring, you can wait till they're budding. You can take a shovel and just dig them up rather wildly, cut them off and plant them. This is bellwort, a bunch that big that looks like one plant. You hose it off, you can untie it, literally. Don't do it like a Gordian knot with an axe, just use your fingers. This one plant, which is about a foot in diameter, gave us 10 plantable, bloomable bellworts. There's one of my neighbor kids. I hired a lot of neighbor kids. The mothers loved it because they got free babysitting. Here's a spring beauty. You can dig them up right now if you want. You got to go deep enough to get the roots and the little bulb, which some people call a nut. And these things can be a yard, not a yard, but these can be 8 inches to a foot above ground from where the nut is. So you got to be kind of careful. You can take that and plant it this deep somewhere else and get your spring beauty. Collecting seeds, you just got to know your plant. This is bluebell. Seeds, 4 to a pod, not ripe. What you got to do, unless you want to pick them out individually, you cut it off here, put it in a paper bag, wait 2 weeks, shake it, and the ripe seeds fall off. The not ripe ones you throw away. Spring beauty. Spring beauty will be blooming on its flower stalk at the same time at the base, seeds have already dehisced and left the plant. Others are ripe, others are almost ripe. You can do a small number of these in a patch and do no damage to them. I pinch it off with my fingernail rather than cut it. Put it in a paper bag, wait 2 weeks. Some of these will mature and you rattle the bag, you can hear the seeds, throw away the stems, they're all dried up by then, and you've got seeds. Now, this I call the Charmin test. If you know who Mr. Whipple is, you'll get this. Do some of you know what I'm talking about? Charmin and Mr. Whipple, squeezably soft? All right. I give up.
Yes.
Or, you know, most people these days, I think if you're over 50, you might know. Anyway, if you squeeze the seeds of bloodroot, the seed pods of bloodroot, celandine poppy, and several other plants, if they don't pop open, they're not ripe. That's a Charmin test, squeezably soft. If they pop open, you got a cup and you just knock the seeds right into the cup. Echinacea and rattlesnake master, etc. You can collect the seed heads in the fall or bend the thing over, take a 5-gallon bucket here and BTS it, if you can figure out what that means. And you just beat it, and the seeds fall off the head into the bucket, and you got a bucket of seeds. You don't have to cut it and try and knock the seeds off. You do that with a lot of plants, including penstemon once it starts to open. Another good way to get your plants is to look at the ones in your garden. This is a Jacob's ladder. This is not a good example, but these are Jacob ladder seedlings that are just a couple weeks old. You can take a butter knife and dig up the seedling of Jacob's ladder, bloodroot, May-apples, just all kinds of plants. They're going to die anyway because the mother plant is going to shade them and kill them for most of them. So get the ones close to the mother plant, and you can put them in a tray and grow them. If you got problems with squirrels and things, you can make any kind of cage you want and put over it. I was lucky to get these freezer cages for free on a garage sale, but you can put a window screen over it. If you've got a small growing bed with seeds in the fall, put a window screen over it. Raindrops, when they come down, they're like bombs. They hit, they splash, and your seeds all go flying. If you put a window screen over it, the birds can't get them, the squirrels can't get them, and the raindrop hits and shatters on the screen rather than knocking your seeds around. You can grow plants in a grow bag. These are Solomon seal. There's like 50 or more of them. I put a whole bunch of seeds in this bag 3 years before then. And in the second year, you can start harvesting, selling, giving away, whatever you want to do. Don't be intimidated by what the rule book says, whether they're shade or sun plants. This is an oak tree in my front yard. It's pretty shady, but all these prairie plants are perfectly happy because they do get enough sun. So don't assume you've got too much shade or too much sun for wildflowers. Test a few, you might be surprised. So if there's any questions, how many minutes are left?
You're just on great, so thank you, Doc. So I encourage John to get through in 40 minutes, so we have time for questions, and the other students will be walking in the middle of this. So there's time. You did great.
Okay,
So
we'll take questions as long as we can. Yes, sir.
Is there any qualitative difference from a pollinator's perspective on a cultivated variety of, say, Rudbeckia or Echinacea versus the native
The
version?
jury's out on that. A lot depends on how it was bred. Some cultivars have a beautiful flower. Read the packet on sunflowers. Some of them say no pollen. They've been bred to be beautiful, but not have pollen, because people who sell flowers for decorations and weddings, they don't want a ton of yellow pollen on the table. There's all kinds of things that have multiple flowers and things. The answer is, if they've been bred to retain their nectar and pollen, they're good for bees and butterflies. If they've been bred to reduce that in favor of bigger flowers, and remember, when you're doing genetics, a plant has so much energy, and you can target, especially today with all the stuff they're doing. If you want a new nose, you'll just order it in the future, but it just depends on how they were bred. And Doug Tallamy says for most of the ones he's familiar with, there doesn't seem to be a negative effect. But he's probably using cultivars that are very close to the original. I prefer to use natives, pure natives, not take a chance. Yes, natural history survey.
Yeah, is there any, like, my yard is covered in Siberian squill. Does that offer anything to,
I'm not that, is that a native or a non?
no, it's not native.
Okay. It probably doesn't offer a lot. Watch it for an hour in the morning and the afternoon.
We
and-
get a lot of honeybees. That's about it.
But you know what I thought of honeybees.
Yeah.
There. Of course, if the honeybee's taking nectar from your squirrel, it's not taking nectar from something the others need, but probably a good bit of the hive is doing yours and the rest of them are raiding the native plants, but I can't answer that question really. But if you got a whole yard full of them, let's start getting some other stuff in your yard. Somebody else, yes.
Oh, yeah, so you were talking about collecting seeds at the end, but I was wondering, like, if I just left the plant alone, would they bloom the next year without me doing anything?
Will the plant bloom the next year?
Yeah. the seeds
If
will
you
fall on their
cut the
own.
seed head off, yes, because almost all of these plants have an underground stem, a rhizome, a bulb, something. And they basically suck their juices down into the soil when they're going dormant. And that is nutrients for early growth next year. So in most cases, there's probably exceptions, but in most cases, you can trim the seed heads off without doing any damage. When I trim the seed heads, when they're still growing actively off of, you know, as you get older, you have trouble recalling names. I'm having a problem right now. The yellow plant that the bee used for the ice cream cone, Zizia aurea. I cut the heads off that every spring and the plants come back every year just fine. So the answer is, I'm not aware of any damage. Unless maybe they get an infection. But also remember, a lot of bees nest in the dead stems. So I try to leave some dead stems, and I threw out about 500 pictures I could have used today, especially of people's yards and how to grow things. I've got pictures of plants from seed to adult for about 20 species, showing all the stages, and where the roots look like, et cetera. But anyway, a lot of bees nest in stems. So if you can leave some stems, that's a good thing. Anybody else? Yes.
I took a landscaping course. I went to U of I actually. I took a couple landscape courses with Andrea Faber-Taylor, if you know her.
I don't know her, but I think I knew the person who taught the class ahead of her.
Okay, yeah.
I give talks there every new teacher doesn't know I exist. So I've given maybe 3 talks in 15 years to the landscape architecture department.
Yeah, so I
Good
really,
question.
I really enjoyed her class. I was just gonna kind of offer to the group that if you're interested in planting native plants, I'd recommend learning some like really simple landscape design principles, like simple things like grouping of 3 is a technique you can use to help your landscape design look less messy and more socially acceptable. So those simple things can really make a difference.
If you got a small area and you want to have 10 plants, groups of 3s work really well.
Mhm.
Bigger groups work even better.
Yeah.
But single plants either end up taking over or getting killed by their neighbors. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I've been reading about solar farms and you know how it sounds great to have native plants in those areas where the panels are. But they're finding that people who design them really don't know much about botany and about
I beat my head on that
combination.
wall.
And that you have to plan those solar farms quite a lot higher so that you can get the diversity of different native plants throughout the season. And they're just not monitored.
Yeah.
If you have any resources on how to guide organizations who are thinking about promoting those.
I'm not aware of any guidelines, but if I were doing it, I would get short native plants that tolerate a reasonable amount of sun and shade. Put them in. You could also do something like Antonaria neglecta, the pussy toe. It's very short, it covers densely. But these people, like you say, they don't have any idea what they're doing. In fact, most landscape architects who graduated before the last 10 years don't know what they're doing because they were never trained. They're still the impression he puts some native plants in. The promoters say you don't have to water them, you don't have to weed them, they just grow. Well, that's not true. Yeah. But anyway, the landscapers, architects I've talked to, they're interested in learning what really works. And it takes a lot of education. The typical planting at University of Illinois, they hire a contractor puts in 7 or 8 species, either all together or in clusters, goes away. There's no maintenance by anybody. Facilities and services might water it once in a while, but unless student volunteers weed it, it just goes. You can
You're fine.
get my,
Stick?
no, my, tundra.
Okay,
I don't wanna leave.
got it, boss.
Anyway, they do it, in the military, they call it a fire and forget missile. Fire and forget wildfires. Put them in. Don't worry about them. Our contract's over. Somebody else can worry about them. That's the way it works. Did you get the thumb drive?
Yep, it's right there.
Okay. Back there, you had a question.
I'm interested in solar pollinator mixes as well for solar farms. And I've been advocating, trying to find out what mix will work well so there will be success. And I want to be ready so the neighbors don't start screaming and yelling and saying, you can't do that ugly business. I want there to be pretty prairie there. And I understand that there's a solar pollinator kind of scorecard that the state has. Is that not useful?
I don't know about that, so I can't give you a good answer. Are you talking about a solar panels in somebody's private yard, or are you talking about a big one?
We're wanting to do a solar farm, actually have signed a contract, and I put in that I wanted, and they must have prairie native plants. I want to have native plants, and I don't want them because they're based somewhere they don't know.
They don't know and they really don't
Spend
care.
prairie advocate, and I know you can't put big blue stem. And so I'm looking for the perfect pollinator mix to advocate and say, this is what you're gonna do. It'll take them a million years
Okay.
to get
Probably
to the point
need-
where I need that, but I'm working
You
now.
probably need a custom mix that you either pick yourself or you call Prairie Moon or some other natural prairie place. Tell them what you want, that you want short plants. And if they're in a solar farm, remember, there's a lot of shade during the day. So you maybe don't want a full sun, but Antonaria neglecta, pussy toes comes to mind. It gets about that tall and it's really dense.
And super
And-
awesome,
And what?
and super awesome too.
A pretty good plant. But anyway, you're gonna need short plants. And they're not gonna make the solar panels higher, so you're gonna have to find things growing them. There's lots of plants that grow 2 to 3 feet high. And if the panel is like that and there's only a foot of clearance here, maybe they've got some grass here that they mow under between once in a while. There's also something called eco grass, which is sold by Prairie Moon Nursery, which is supposed to be short, resilient, and you only gotta mow it twice a year. Eco grass, Prairie Moon Nursery. Anybody else? There's another question over here.
Is there a minimum diameter if you wanna do the honeysuckle, like bee houses?
No, I did it last week. I cut a lot of honeysuckle. Different honeysuckle stems have different size holes. We cut bales of truckloads of it, pickup truck. I always, if I'm looking for a bee nest, I cut some, usually the stems maybe up to a half an inch. Have a decent size hole. And you wanna get a length about like that, so if I cut one and if the hole looks good, I cut it again and I put it aside for using for bees. You can also take the stems in the fall from rattlesnake master, certain sunflowers, even bee balm. And cut them off and put them in with your bundle. There's all kinds of bees of all sizes that'll live in those little holes. What you don't want to do is get a whole big mass of it in one area because then the parasites will find the bees. If you want to read an exciting book about some of this stuff, that's more an analysis of plants and how they react to things. There's a new book out called The Light Eaters. And it talks a lot about what I'll call pheromones given off by plants and insects. And many insect bees and butterflies, they find the plant the same way they find their mate. They smell their way to the cluster more than the individual. And if there's a cluster, it's visually more accessible and it puts out more of the perfume or whatever. There are also evidence now, good laboratory evidence, that some plants, when a caterpillar bites them, they immediately start synthesizing chemicals that repel those insects. And they let off a pheromone, and other plants of the same species that haven't been bitten yet start generating the same chemicals. It's hard to believe, but these plants seem to communicate a little bit with pheromones and things, but it's an interesting book. Whether you believe everything they say is questionable, but it's an interesting, thought-provoking thing, especially for what we do with the plants. If the plants interact, some plants have allelochemicals that poison other plants. Supposedly, garlic mustard does that. And I didn't show my garlic mustard pictures, but I've got pictures of forests. The entire understory is solid garlic mustard. And after 4 years of pulling garlic mustard, it's not there anymore. The other thing, if you ever do garlic mustard, the rule of thumb is pull them in the spring when they're in bloom, carry the whole plant out, and you're done for that year. Nah, go back a few weeks after they're done blooming, and they've got these little pods from about a third of the way down. They're full of seeds that aren't ripe yet. Take your hand, glove or not, put it around the stem, go up the stem. 95% of those pods will be in your hand. You throw them in a 5-gallon bucket. I had 2 students spend 2 hours, I think it was, in a patch. And they had 9 gallons of seed pods after 2 hours. When the seeds are ripe and it's falling off like rain, even when they're ripe, you can get the seeds, get buckets of seeds. Every seed you get out of there is a plant that doesn't grow the next year. You do that a couple of years in a row, spring and seeds and buds, you can get the garlic mustard out of an area.
Okay.
I think people are leaving enough, we gotta
Yep,
go.
so I think killing garlic mustard is a good way to stop, okay, so thank you. So, let's see. So, thanks again for coming. I think we have a few minutes if anyone wants to talk to John here. I'll be going out to lunch with him if anyone's interested in that. But I think I will say something that's related to this. For the PLC, I'll be having people at my house looking at my garden sometime in the near future,
May 16th.
May 16th. And so Prairie Land Conservancy is someone you can check with that. The end. Thanks for coming.
Kill stuff, you can do that with us too.
Yes.
Okay, down to the front if you want to pitch stuff. Okay, thanks, everybody.
My thing is on there. I'm not sure. I might have stayed on the phone.
Yeah.
Thank you. I hope that was useful to you.
Oh, it was great.
Yeah. Yeah.